First of all, thank you for sticking around. I appreciate you taking the time to continue to educate on noise topics. This presentation has been done several times over the decades to ONCC members, but also myself and my colleagues have done this at noise conferences and other airports. This is kind of an introduction to noise, sometimes especially given to new noise management personnel at airports or other new consultants to the industry. So I got about 40 slides here, so a lot of content to cover. It's going to be about an hour. We're going to talk about noise itself. What is it? What influences people's reaction to sounds and noise? We'll discuss decibels. What are decibels? How do we measure decibels? How do we add decibels and use them in our calculations? We'll talk about how noise dissipates, whether through buildings or the air, and how we calculate that. I'll give you some rules of thumb when it comes to aircraft noise. Some of them are pretty important, so hopefully you'll remember them. We'll look at everyday sounds so we can compare that to when we're talking about these decibel levels. What does that relate to in your everyday experiences? We'll discuss aircraft noise and how that's been reduced over the years around airports, as well as metrics and how we measure them. Hopefully there'll be time at the end for questions, but as we move through them, feel free to just raise your hand and ask any questions. We're happy to just be casual about it. So, first off, what is noise? And specifically, we need to define the difference between sound and noise, because they're not necessarily the same thing. Sound is a physical phenomenon consisting of vibrations which can be sensed by the human ear by traveling through the air or water. Okay, so it's energy in waves that your ear picks up. Where noise, in general terms, is any unwanted sound, anything that is unwelcomed. It is temporary. Once the noise stops, it's gone. And the perception of sound is highly subjective. So, for instance, some people can hear a sound and it could be very appealing to them, where another person would hear that exact same sound and be extremely upset by it. I personally have a real allergic reaction to country music. Some people find country music to be very enjoyable. I find it to be atrocious, and anytime I hear it, I need to leave wherever I am immediately. So again, it's very subjective. And also when it comes to aircraft noise is also subjective. I personally, of course, enjoy aircraft noise. I know that I'm not, speaking for the majority of the population, but I'm an airplane geek. I enjoy airplanes, and I really enjoy the sound of aircraft. And anytime one is flying over, I look up to see what it is, see if I can guess what airplane it is, just by the sound, by the visual. So it really is subjective, and not everyone has the same reaction to sound as the next person. And so that's something important to remember, that you may have one constituent that's really upset how loud the aircraft noise is, but their neighbor doesn't bother them at all. So it's this subjective factor when it comes to noise is something important to remember. So how do we perceive sound? So perception of sound depends on several physical measurable characteristics. One being intensity or the volume. Another is the frequency or the pitch. Sounds with concentrations of energy between 2,000 and 8,000 hertz are generally perceived to be noisier than sounds outside of that range. Changes in sound level pressure also influence our perception of sound. Sounds that are increasing in volume tend to be somewhat perceived as louder than sounds that are decreasing in volume. For instance, think of an ambulance coming towards you and driving by. The sound level of that ambulance and its sirens is increasing, and then this was referred to as the Doppler effect. As it drives by, it decreases. If you were to, even though both of those instances, the approaching and then driving away, has the same energy value, if you were to ask someone which one was louder, they would most likely say, well, as it was coming towards me, it was much louder than as it was driving away. Rates of change in level of sound also influences how we perceive it. Impulse sound, or like a jackhammer, is perceived as much louder than maybe another sound that may have the same energy value but is not as impulse levels. All right, so there are also emotional and physical variables affecting how one would perceive sound. Where I am at the time a sound occurs, am I in an urban environment or am I in my backyard, would influence how I react to a particular sound. My attitude towards where I am I at a ball game or am I walking in the woods with my dog? My own sensitivity to noise. People have different sensitivities to levels of noise and therefore react differently. My beliefs about how that noise is affecting my health, the feelings of fear associated with that noise, is it startling? My feelings about how preventable that noise is that something that I think doesn't need to be happening right now, and so that more increases my annoyance level with the noise. Where I am I, in my neighborhood trying to have a nice dinner party with my friends in the backyard in the afternoon on a summer day. These would all kind of influence how annoyed I am by an external sound source. So we measure sound in decibels, and we use the dB for short. Decibels are the logarithmic unit of measurement on the loudness scale. So it's important to understand that decibels are a logarithmic metric and not a linear metric. The range of sound pressures that we experience are from what we can barely hear to what would be painful to hear is so great that using linear numbers is you're familiar with the Richter scale. An earthquake of 6 on the Richter scale is 10 times stronger than an earthquake that's 5 on the Richter scale. Decibel scale, logarithmic scale is the same way. Two sounds of the same level are not perceived to be twice as loud. Two sounds of the same level actually is only a 3 decibel increase. So we have to think that this is not linear. It's not like one addition onto another. A 10 decibel increase in acoustical energy is a doubling of acoustical energy. So if you think about that, the difference between 55 decibels, someone hears a noise at 55 decibels, and someone hears a noise at 65 decibels. The person who heard it at 65 decibels is actually perceiving it twice as loud as the person who heard it at 55 decibels. So when we're talking about these numbers, 55, 65, 75, it's important to understand what that difference is in sound energy, and it's pretty significant. So, to give an example, let's say I decide to measure my son in this little race car here, and I want to record how loud his little race car is as he drives by. And so he drives by, and I record him at 72 decibels. Now, let's say I put his brother in the exact same type of car, and they both drive by me at the exact same time, at the exact same speed, and I record him at 72 decibels as well. What is the overall sound reading as they go by? Is it 144 decibels? No, it's only 75 decibels. So, important to understand when we're talking about decimals and the logarithmic characteristic of it, that when we double something, let's say we have one airplane at 75 decibels and two airplanes at 75 decibels, that's not 150 decibels, that's only 78 decibels when they're combined. Decibel weighting, so in the acoustical world, we talk about weighting with decibels. We always refer to decibels when we're speaking about it as A-weighted. I'm not going to go into much detail here. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to explain the anatomy of the ear, but A-weighted decibels are weighted so that they closely match the frequency that the human ear hears. Human ears are designed to be most sensitive to about 3,000 hertz, which just happens to be the frequency of the human voice, so it makes sense. Most common sounds are between 2,000 and 4,000 hertz, and so the A-weighted decibel is weighted to be as close to that range as possible. All right, some rules of thumb when it comes to decibels. The smallest detectable change by the human ear is only 1 decibel, so which I probably couldn't be able to detect. And this is in like a sound studio, laboratory setting, pin drop. Okay, that's about as small as of a change as that you can detect. Most people, like myself, would be able to notice about a 3 decibel change. Again, adding 2 like sounds adds 3 decibels increase. Okay, this is an important one. So if you were to think of it in airport operations, doubling or cutting in half the amount of operations only adds or subtracts 3 decibels. Okay, 10 decibels sounds twice as loud or twice as quiet. Again, somebody who experiences a 75 decibel flyover versus a 65 decibel flyover hears it twice as loud. Another rule of thumb is double or half the distance between a sound and the receiver equates to a plus or minus 6 dB. So if I'm standing 6 feet away from a noise source and I hear it at 70 decibels and then I move to 12 feet away, I'm now hearing it at 64 decibels, so a 6 decibel decrease. Here are some common sound levels on the decibel scale. Outdoor sound levels as well as indoor sound levels. Towards the bottom, we have the threshold of hearing under 10 decibels, and as we get louder, we're looking at a quiet rural nighttime setting or a library. Moving up the scale, we get to quiet urban nighttime and daytime settings or in a business office, a theater. We get into the 60s and 70s. Now we're talking normal speech, some aircraft levels, a commercial area. Moving up the scale, it's 85 decibels. Now I'm yelling at you. That's what my kids hear on a daily basis, is usually 85 or up on the scale. We have large urban environments, lawnmowers, tractors, a 747-800 takeoff. Top of the scale, we got a subway train, and important to note, a rock band, not a country music band, at the top of the scale here. Okay, noise absorption and attenuation. So I mentioned that 6 decibel increase or decrease per doubling of distance. So again, just air alone attenuates noise. So the further I get away from the noise source, the air is going to decrease the intensity of that noise. Again, every doubling is a 6 decibel increase or decrease. A typical house will attenuate noise from the outside just based on its structure and how it's built. 15 decibels with windows open and 25 decibels with windows closed. So if it's externally 65 decibels with the windows open in the house, you're only going to hear about 50 decibels, just the way the house is attenuating noise. If I close the windows, that's another 10 decibels down to 40. Other environmental factors will influence how noise is attenuated. A soft surface like a grass or forest will absorb noise more than a large lake or a parking lot or concrete structures. So other environmental factors will influence how well the noise travels. All right. Any questions before we move on to noise metrics? Okay, we'll keep going. So we have a handful of noise metrics. Some of these you have heard, others you may be hearing for the first time. We're going to talk about LMAX. I did a real poor job of explaining that earlier in the aircraft noise comparison exhibit. We're going to talk about that. I have a little video for you to watch. Will hopefully help explain it better than I did. Equivalent sound level, sound exposure level, the day-night average sound level, which you all should have heard at this point. We're going to explain exactly what that is. And then we have some other metrics, community noise equivalent level, time above, and number of events above we'll touch on. So the first one is LMAX. And so I have a little video here that was developed for the Transportation Research Board to help explain the LMAX metric.
The video sequence will demonstrate the aircraft noise metric, maximum noise level, also known as LMAX. On the right, an aircraft will be shown taking off and beginning its flight. The multicolored bubbles surrounding the aircraft as it travels will represent the intensity of the sound which reaches the ground in all directions. For an observer standing at the pink bullseye, the approximate sound event will be played through your speakers. The sound level for this observer will also be graphed on the left with the moving bar representing the current moment in time. For an observer located at the pink bullseye, the aircraft sound level gradually rose, reached a maximum, and then gradually fell. The level of the sound when it was loudest is known as the LMAX. LMAX is expressed in decibels.
Okay, so that's LMAX again. During that time event, what was the loudest point of noise in decibels that was experienced at the receiver point? Next metric is LEQ. We use the LEQ metric in our nighttime noise reports. It is the average sound level over any specified period. We use these for specific aircraft events. Time period will depend on the duration, but if we're talking about any events that are less than 24 hours, we would use LEQ would be the appropriate metric. For a time period that has special meaning, like nighttime or school hours or specific hours of the day, LEQ is that average cumulative noise of sound exposure that's averaged logarithmically. So another way to explain it in our graph chart here, so we have a noise event. The event occurs when the noise levels in decibels increases over the ambient sound level. So you can see on the x-axis we have our time, on the y-axis we have our decibel levels. The duration of the event above ambient is 40 seconds. And so we're taking all of the energy in decibels of that event during that 40 seconds, and we're averaging it logarithmically. And so the LEQ is 73 decibels versus Lmax, which is just the single point of highest decibel level during the noise event. Okay, so that's LEQ, equivalent sound level. Next metric is sound exposure level, and I have another video to explain this metric.
The following video sequence will demonstrate the aircraft noise metric, sound exposure level, also known as SEL. On the right, an aircraft will be shown taking off and beginning its flight. The multicolored bubbles surrounding the aircraft as it travels will represent the intensity of the sound which reaches the ground in all directions. For an observer standing at the pink bullseye, the approximate sound event will be played through your speakers. The sound level for this observer will also be graphed on the left with a moving bar representing the current moment in time. From the beginning of the sound event until the end, a certain amount of sound energy is transferred from the aircraft to the observer. The total energy transfer depends both on how long the event lasts and how loud the event is. The sound energy exposure as experienced by an observer is quantified by the noise metric SEL. SEL can be thought of as the sound level in decibels, which would be heard if all the sound energy were compressed into an event lasting exactly 1 second.
So this is a tough metric that I personally don't like to use when discussing aircraft noise with the average person because it is very difficult to for someone to comprehend that we're taking a noise event and compressing all the energy into a 1 second instance so that we can take into account both the intensity and the duration. The problem is people don't hear SEL. That's a metric that someone is going to have a very hard time relating to, but we do use it in the acoustical world to compare noise events of varying durations and intensity. But again, this is one that's difficult to explain and to conceptualize, so I try to stay away from it personally. But you will see the sound exposure level metric used in the airport noise world. So to give another example of why I don't like SEL, we have 3 different noise events here. We have an impulse noise and an aircraft flyover and roadway noise. So the impulse noise is just happens, in a second, and you can see in the black box over here, it reached 105 decibels at its peak, and the SEL is 100 decibels. Now, the aircraft flyover, that event occurred over a period of time. The Lmax was 88 decibels, but it has the exact same SEL value. So the sound energy of both of those events compressed down to 1 second is the same. And roadway noise, an Lmax of 76 decibels over a period of time, 71 LEQ, but 100 SEL. So again, all 3 of these events have the same exact SEL value, but you can see why it's confusing. If you were to ask someone who experienced all three of these, would they characterize them as the same? Probably not. So that's the struggle with the SEL metric. All right, DNL, the one that we, yes, Mr. Ikes.
Back to the SEL for just a second. If you were to be speaking to or talk to an audiologist and he was evaluating damage to the hearing, the neural hearing mechanism, is that when they would consider SEL? I mean, exposure to higher levels of sound?
Honestly, I'm not sure. My guess would be no, because SEL really has to, rather than what the exposure is, it's really looking at the source event and trying to characterize it and be able to compare that to other events so that you can compare the energy levels rather than the loudness and how that might have a medical issue with your ear. So I think SEL is more used when we're looking to compare, different sound events that have different characteristics. We're out in the field and we're analyzing, several different sources of noise. SEL would then be used to compare those noise levels. But again, it's a metric that is useful in analysis, but not so much in describing the impact of noise or the experience of noise. Okay, DNL. Most of you should have heard this metric by now. This is the preferred metric of choice in the aviation world. This video will explain.
The following video sequence will demonstrate the aircraft noise metric, day-night average sound level, also known as DNL. As the video begins, aircraft are shown flying arrival and departure procedures to and from the major airport in high speed. Green and red trails behind the aircraft show the travel paths of arrivals and departures, respectively. Each arriving or departing aircraft is continuously transferring energy to the ground in the form of noise. The louder and lower the aircraft, the more noise energy it produces on the ground. The size of the multicolored bubbles surrounding each aircraft correspond to how much noise energy is being transferred to the ground at any given moment. The essence of DNL and all other cumulative noise metrics is to represent the total accumulation of aircraft noise energy over some period of time. If we focus on the pink bullseye on the map, each passing flight transfers some total amount of noise energy to the ground at that location. As the flights pass, the graph on the left shows aircraft noise energy accumulating at that point. The flights that come nearest to the pink bullseye tend to transfer the most noise energy to that location. Over the course of a day, a great deal of aircraft noise energy may accumulate. DNL is different from many cumulative metrics in that it puts an extra emphasis on nighttime flights. Nighttime flights are defined as those happening between 10 o'clock p.m. and 7 o'clock a.m. To account for the extra sensitivity many people have to nighttime flights, the calculation of DNL multiplies the actual noise energy transferred from these flights by 10. In other words, a flight at night counts 10 times as much in the calculation of DNL as a similar flight in the day. This is referred to as the DNL nighttime penalty. At the end of a full 24-hour period, the DNL value can be calculated. To calculate DNL, all the accumulated noise energy from the daytime and the nighttime is added together, including the influence of the nighttime penalty. The total noise energy from the day and the night is then distributed evenly over the entire 24-hour period. With the aircraft noise energy distributed evenly, the result is a single continuous noise level in decibels. This level is the DNL.
Okay, so again, DNL is a cumulative metric, so it's the cumulative noise energy that is exposed throughout a time period of 24 hours or more that is averaged out to give you a level, decibel level that represents that entire sound energy exposure. It has that nighttime penalty weighting of 10 decibels, so any sound energy that occurs after 10 p.m. or before 7 a.m. is weighted 10 times. So you can see kind of the math here. We take the total daytime sound energy, we add it to 10 times the total nighttime sound energy divided by the total time in seconds, and that's how we get DNL. Again, it's the metric of choice in the airport world. It is still currently required to define noise contours by the Federal Aviation Administration for environmental studies such as National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA studies or Part 150 studies. We can use other metrics, but they are supplemental. DNL is still required as the metric to use when disclosing noise impacts. All federal agencies have adopted DNL as the metric for airport noise analysis. Again, I want to emphasize when we're talking about cumulative metrics and the difference with DNL is that nighttime penalty. Again, to give you an example here, that intrusive penalty factor is, of course, to penalize operations that occur during the nighttime hours when most people would be affected by sleep. You know, we don't want to wake the babies, and so harsh penalties for any flights that occur at night. You can see in our metric here, if we were to take the total daytime energy of 75 aircraft and then add that to the total nighttime energy of 20 aircraft, but that 20 aircraft is multiplied tenfold, so it's really accounting 200 operations versus 20 in that calculation. So it's a significant nighttime penalty factor. And so something to consider in DNL, any changes in nighttime operation levels is going to have a significant impact in the DNL value because of this nighttime penalty. Not only the volume of flights, but the type of flights is going to have a significant impact. By the way, this is my daughter, just if you were wondering. All right, one of the other issues with DNL is how DNL can have various different scenarios have the same value, similar to the issues we've had with SEL. So we have 4 different scenarios here that all have the same 65 decibel DNL value. So we have scenario A, which is 1 aircraft, and it has a 114.4 decibel SEL value, 65 DNL value. Scenario B is 10 flights at 104 SEL is 65 DNL. Scenario C is 100 flights at 94 SEL is the same as 10 flights at 65 DNL. So you can see now how varying the levels and increasing the operation levels, you can have the same DNL values. Scenario D, if we had 1,000 flights per day at 84.4 decibel SEL, that is the same 65 DNL value as 1 flight that day at 114.4 SEL value. So 1 very loud aircraft can equal 1,000 very quiet aircraft in value when we're talking about DNL. So that makes it challenging, again, when talking with people and their experiences on the ground, especially at airports like O'Hare that have a large level of operations. And we say, well, 65 DNL is, and we'll get to the 65 DNL and its significance, kind of the threshold of significance when the airport world, you're outside the 65 decibel, but they're experiencing hundreds and hundreds of flights over their head, it becomes challenging to have that person be able to relate to that 65 DNL number and what they're experiencing on the ground. So the 65 DNL metric, another controversial metric that continues to be debated whether or not it is needs to be reconsidered as the metric of choice when we're discussing aircraft noise and disclosing its impacts. So again, 65 decibel DNL is what the FAA has established for significant impacts. So anything when they are doing an environmental study and disclosing impacts, anything that is 65 decibels or higher is considered to be significant. That could potentially translate into mitigation depending on the circumstances. This is why we use the 65 DNL noise contour when we are discussing the residential sound insulation program. Again, no matter where the threshold is set, there will be people, unfortunately, living just outside that line that will continue to be frustrated and have a difficult time understanding why they're not eligible or they're not considered significantly impacted, but their neighbor is. Anytime we draw a line, there's going to be people on one side and the other, and it's always a challenge when talking to those people just outside that line to tell them that they're considered not significantly impacted.
Excuse me, Brian,
Yeah.
back up to page 22. Is it possible with the fleet mix that we have at O'Hare now, approximating it, is it possible to exceed 65 DNL?
Yes. I'm not sure I understand the question.
General area, I know, we have, the current models have minimized the 65 DNL areas instead of the contours growing, they shrunk.
Yeah.
How do they account for that?
It's a good question, and I'm going to get to that.
Okay, carry on.
So here is the current 65 DNL noise contour, the terminal area plan environmental assessment that the FAA approved in the fall of 2022. Part of that environmental assessment was the disclosure of significant noise impacts. To do that, they use, again, the noise contour. The noise contour is developed using the Aviation Environmental Design Tool, a model, which includes several factors, including the number of operations, the types of aircraft, where they're flying, the time of day, the way they're flown, how air traffic is using the airspace, how frequently each runway is used, and routes of flights are all considered for future condition. This particular future condition that was being evaluated was the terminal area plan. And so the disclosure here with the 65 DNL contour is saying, here are the significant noise impacts once that project is completed, expected to be in 2032. And so the FAA and the CDA use future impacts to inform where to invest sound mitigation funds. And so any homes within the 65 DNL are potentially eligible for those mitigation funds. Now, as Frank was mentioning, the contours have changed, and this is kind of this nebulous shape that changes depending on several factors. As I mentioned before, some of the factors that we really need to think about are the daytime, nighttime operation levels. Those are going to have a heavily impact on variations in the noise contour, especially when extended over a long period of time, how the runways are being used, and the types of aircraft, the fleet mix that is assumed, and how they are being flown. All are going to heavily influence the shape of the noise contour. Now remember, the contour is a cumulative aircraft, it represents a cumulative aircraft noise energy. So that line, anywhere specifically on that specific line is the 65 DNL. So anywhere in there, a point on that line is 65.0 DNL. As you move in closer, 66, 67, 68, 69, just like contours on a terrain map, as you get closer to the mountain, the contours get closer, the elevation gets higher, same with the noise energy level as you get closer to the sound source. So that is the contour. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what has led to changes in the size of the contour over decades in a few slides here, but are there any other questions about DNL before I move on? Okay. We have some additional metrics that you may or may not heard of. There's a community equivalent sound level, CNEL. The state of California has come up with their own metric that they use in place of DNL. It's the same as DNL, except they've added an additional penalty for flights that occur in the evening hours between 7 and 10. So we have that nighttime 10 decibel penalty factor with DNL. This adds a 4.77 decibel weighting for evening hours, 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. Generally results in larger contours because of that evening hour penalty factor. Another supplemental metric is time above. Time above represents the time, generally in minutes or seconds, that noise is, noise is above a given level. So the number of time of above a certain level, so that's 65 decibels. Let's say with a project, the amount of time above 65 is 800 versus with the project, it's 1,100. So you're looking at how long above a certain decibel level certain projects may impact. We use this sometimes as a metric when looking at schools, because in evaluating during the school hours what levels and how long those levels are going to be during the school hours that may affect the teacher's ability to teach class. Another supplemental metric is number of events above. Similar to time above, this one is flipped and it represents the number of events above a specified noise level for a period of time. So instead of the time, it's the actual number of events. It combines both noise level and number of overflights to develop an expression of the experience. It can be useful for explaining what a person is currently experiencing or what they may experience in the future. So it would be a number, let's say it would be represented by, you would typically be experiencing 100 flights a day over 65 decibels at this specific place or time versus another position that might experience only 50 events above 65 decibels. So NA number of events above. All right, moving on to who controls aircraft noise. I just want to kind of lay out some of the stakeholders and areas of responsibility. Ultimately, Congress sets the bar for aircraft noise. They're the ones that establish how the FAA evaluates noise impacts. So any ceiling on aircraft noise really is set by Congress. FAA sets the aircraft noise certification levels, reviews and approves noise compatibility planning, and of course manages air traffic and airspace. The airport proprietor, the owner, such as the Chicago Department of Aviation, monitors the aircraft noise, develops noise abatement procedures, and implements noise mitigation in the communities around the airport. State and local governments, they have the ability to implement land use compatibility plans. So any municipalities such as Bensonville can come up with land use plans in conjunction with the airport. So understanding where significant noise exposures are, can develop a land use plan to make sure residential areas aren't being developed in those areas. And of course, aircraft operators are responsible for investing in quieter aircraft and following any noise abatement procedures. There are a number of federal statutes governing aircraft noise. I'm going to just touch on a few of them. The Airport Noise and Capacity Act of 1990 is really significant and has driven a lot of the noise reduction we've seen over the last decades and how those noise contours have shrunk over the years. Part 36 is how the FAA has adapted the Airport Noise and Capacity Act. We're also going to talk about some of the other orders and Code of Federal Regulations that the FAA follows. So the big one is the Airport Noise and Capacity Act of 1990, which was passed by Congress in November of 1990. And it was really a trade-off. Leading up to this passing of this legislation, aircraft noise related to airports had become a really significant issue across the country. Airports all over the place in response to this, especially with communities becoming more and more concerned. We're implementing various noise procedures, and we're disclosing noise impacts that didn't really have consistency across the country. And so Congress was trying to balance those community interests with aviation interests. Obviously, we want the economy to grow. Aviation is a big part of that. And so they came up with this trade-off. And the balance was the Airport Noise Capacity Act required airlines to phase out older, louder aircraft that were causing really significant noise impacts. And the airlines agreed to this. And the airports agreed not to close or restrict demand at airports due to noise. And so this is that legislation, the Airport Noise and Capacity Act of 1990, that restricts the city of Chicago from closing the airport at night. This legislation makes that prohibited. And so the FAA, in order to adhere to the Act, has a Part 36 requirement, which was called Noise Standards, Aircraft Type, and Airworthiness Certification. So this Part 36 is how the FAA certifies all aircraft, whether it be for airworthiness or noise levels. And so all civil aircraft in the United States or that operate in the United States need a FAA certification. This certification process, of course, has all these safety issues and make sure that the aircraft is designed and functioning in a safe way that meets all the current regulations, but also meets all the noise standards. And so we have currently 5 noise standards that are referred to as stages. Stage 1 is the loudest aircraft types. Those were phased out in 1985. Stage 2 were kind of the next louder aircraft. Those have been phased out since 2000. Stage 2 aircraft have not been permitted to fly within the U.S. airspace since 2015. So airlines phased them out, meaning they no longer bought those and got them out of their fleet. But now they've been completely banned from flying in the U.S. At all. All civil aviation aircraft flying in the U.S. today are stage 3 or higher. They meet those stage 3 standards. And most jets, according to the GAO report in August of 2020, are able to meet stage 4 or 5 standards today. So the vast majority of aircraft that the airlines are flying are meeting those stricter noise requirements. You can see on the right, I've got this diagram here. It shows how the noise energy has been eliminated from aircraft engines over time based on these new noise standards. The outermost contour on the left, the green one, is a stage 1 727. Those of you that are old enough may remember this aircraft type. It first began service in the 1960s. As a matter of fact, when it did come out into production, it was referred to as the quiet jet, and I think it even had that logo on the tail. But it was extremely loud compared to what people experience today. It was a very loud aircraft. It was designed for thrust and basically getting off the ground as quick as possible, and there was no real consideration for how loud it was. And then as we move right, the stage 2, which is the yellow, again, those were phased out in the 80s. Stage 2 were a newer model of 727s, but you can see how much the newer model reduced that sound energy level. And then to the right, purple is a stage 3. That's 727 they came up with a hush kit, basically a mechanism that they put on the engine to reduce the sound levels even more significantly. That's about 38% reduction since the original 727. And then as you move to stage 4, the orange contour, that's a 737 MAX. And you can see how significantly smaller that noise contour is compared to the original 727. And that's 82% reduction on arrival and 95% reduction on departure compared to the original 727 when we're looking at the sound energy levels. So significant noise reduction based on new aircraft engine technology that the airlines were required to invest in. And the big thing is we went from low bypass engines on aircraft to high bypass engines. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this, but the simple comparison is low bypass engines, most of the air goes into the engine and is combusted to create thrust, whereas a high bypass engine, a vast amount of the air actually doesn't even get combusted. It has those very large fans, turbofans on the front that provide a lot of supplemental thrust. And so these engines are much more efficient, and ultimately a nice side effect is they're also much quieter. And so that's why you see much modern aircraft continue to have larger and larger engines because of these high bypass turbofan engines. These pictures show the 737 aircraft with various stages of engines. On the left, you have the 737-200, which was a stage 2. That's a low bypass engine. I kind of compare it to the low bypass to high bypasses, like a cigarette to a cigar. They're much narrower, where high bypasses are much larger and wider. The one in the middle, it's a 737-200. So again, the 737-200 was stage 2, which needed to be phased out by the year 2000. So in order to meet that, airlines established a hush kit, which you can see on the back end of it. It's this kind of muffler they put on to help reduce the sound level and meet the stage 3 noise standards. And now the Boeing 737 MAX has the high bypass turbofan engine and is able to meet the new, most stringent Stage 5 noise standards. So you can see the aircraft, the sound energy reduction of all those engine improvements. So we have a single airframe, the Boeing 737, that has gone through various levels of airframe and engine technology improvements that have resulted in significant noise reduction over the years. You can see in blue, these are 75 LMAX contours. In blue, the original 737-200 versus in yellow, the current 737 MAX 800. So very drastic reduction in noise. Another example here is the Boeing 737-800 Dreamliner. On the left, it's a wide-body modern aircraft with those very large high bypass turbofan engines. The 65 LMAX area is 17.4 square miles compared to a Boeing 737-800 without the MAX engines. You can see, and the reason why I wanted to make this comparison is most people say, well, the larger the airplane, the louder it is. And I want to point out that that is not always the case and is becoming less the case as these new modern aircraft come out. And so the Boeing 787 Dreamliner compared is a wide-body aircraft, much larger than a 737, but significantly quieter because of engine and airframe technology. This compares it to the Dreamliner to the 767-300. The 767-300 is the aircraft that the Dreamliner was built to replace. And so you can see 65 LMAX area on that noise contour, 17.4 square miles versus almost 50 square miles on that aircraft it was designed to replace. So these improvements in engine technology and airframe technology, specifically driven by the Airport Noise and Capacity Act, has really been the driver in reducing aircraft noise impacts at airports across the country. You can see in this diagram, you've probably all seen this one before. It's our mosaic of all of the 65 DNL contours that have been produced at O'Hare going back to 1979. You can see that beige contour of the 1979 contour, how large that was. Again, those are those 727s, 707s, extremely loud aircraft. And as we've made improvements to those aircraft and airframes over the years, we've been able to drastically reduce the noise contour at O'Hare significantly over the years. All right, I do want to touch on thresholds of significance, and actually this slide is a bit out of place, so I apologize. I need to figure out how to better fit this in this presentation. But going back to the 65 DNL and going back to FAA's disclosure of significant noise impacts, I just wanted to point out that the FAA has 3 thresholds of significance to consider when they're disclosing noise impacts. So we talked about the 65 DNL or greater, so that's one threshold where anything in that noise contour is considered significantly impacted. There's an additional threshold of 1.5 dB increase inside the 65 DNL when compared to the no action alternative. So when the FAA is reviewing a environmental or a project, they look at what the future is going to look like with that project and what it looks like without doing that project. And it discloses significant noise impacts if there's a 1.5 dB increase, let's say at a house with project or without. And that's really the threshold of significance when the FAA considers sound mitigation funds. The recent environmental assessment for the terminal area plan really only identified a handful of homes that met that threshold, that 1.5 dB change or more. And that's why one of the current topics that we're talking about in the RSIP program is funding and securing funding for sound insulation. Because there were only 3 homes or 4 homes that were considered significantly impacted, the CDA is going to different sources for funds for sound mitigation, because the FAA will not provide it through the Airport Improvement Program because it didn't meet this threshold of significance. I know that's kind of a bit out of context and a stretch, but I wanted to make that clarification. And then finally, I wanted to touch on FAA's noise research. Some of you may be familiar about some of the studies they've been doing recently on noise metrics. In January 2021, well, actually I should start with the DNL metric, and that 65 decibel DNL threshold of significance was based on a study in the 70s, I believe, and it's referred to as the Schultz curve. You can see in the upper right corner, and it was a study that looked at the percentage of people and how highly they were annoyed by noise levels. And so you can see this curve here, and 65 is when they said, okay, at this point, this is when most people start to get highly annoyed by a noise source. And so that 65 decibel DNL threshold of significance was based on this study. It was reevaluated in the early 90s and reaffirmed. However, in recent decades, there's been a further push on the 65 decibel DNL threshold and its significance. And so the FAA in January of 2021 did a survey called the Neighborhood Environmental Study that included an analysis of levels of aircraft noise that bother homeowners in today's society. And that, in the lower right, is the outcome of that. It's referred to as the national curve, and you can see how significantly different that is from the Schultz curve. People are highly annoyed well beyond the 65 DNL threshold. So one of the outcomes of that, in April of last year, the FAA asked for public comment on its noise policy review, which looked at the FAA's current use of DNL as the primary metric for assessing cumulative noise. I don't know the exact outcome or what's going to happen with either of these studies, but most likely the FAA could potentially inform change in future aircraft noise policy on the federal level. What that is, I have no idea, but regardless of what metric is used, and where the threshold is set, it's not going to change people's experience on the ground. It's not going to make things necessarily quieter. It's just going to change how the FAA discloses those noise impacts. So that's important to understand. So some concluding thoughts. There is clearly a dichotomy between what people experience in their everyday lives when it comes to aircraft noise and what is required by agencies such as the FAA when they prepare and disclose the impacts of environmental studies. The 65 DNL should continue to be debated as the threshold of significance for noise impacts. And clearly investments in airframe and engine technology has had the greatest reduction in noise impacts over the last several decades. And that concludes Noise 101. I appreciate everyone's patience. And are there any questions? Yes, Frank.
If you can relay feelings to anyone that has anything to do with any of this, I think one of the big factors isn't so much the level of the noise, it's the repetitive nature of it during peak times, especially evenings. 85 decibels once every 5 or 10 minutes, it's not gonna really bother you that much. But when you get the evening rush of planes going overhead, and it's every 30 to 45 seconds, you get the planes taking off. And if you happen to be in one of the areas where they'd like to fly over, it is extremely annoying. It's not just uncomfortable, it just, it comes to a point where you want to pack everything up and just go in the house,
Yeah.
because it's impossible to carry on outdoor activities.
That supplemental metric, NA, or number of events above, is a metric that helps to describe that. So that captures people further out than the 65 DNL, and it shows, well, they may have very high levels of instances of aircraft exceeding 65, but when you look at the cumulative energy and average that out, it's less than 65 DNL. So that supplemental metric helps to kind of show those residents that may not be within the 65 but are still experiencing a high frequency of aircraft events.
Something that ATC can address. Go ahead, Mark.
We did submit a response, Ronnie mentioned the noise policy review that the FAA did, and we did submit a response to that, and that was one of the things we argued in support of, using additional supplemental metrics like noise, time above, and number above, in addition to the DNL, just to round out and take a better picture of what's actually happening.
Yeah, I failed to mention that the ONCC as a whole responded to that request for public comments and made several suggestions like that.
In the likelihood that the FAA is not going to do anything meaningful to provide any relief for us, I would recommend that politically we get involved in this to seek relief instead of from the FAA, to get it from the EPA. The FAA has their hands full keeping planes in the air right now. Okay, and I think everybody's heard, they're falling short of their regulatory responsibilities with aircraft and flying. Why don't we petition to have this governed by the EPA instead of the FAA?
Well, that would be an act of Congress.
Right, and if we're to be a group that's working with other agencies and with politicians all around, maybe we can address that and try to get some relief from the EPA. If Evan wanted relief from the noise, he can ticket trains that are out here. There's signs that say no train whistles. Okay, that's from the municipality. They can actually ticket the trains, and they can ticket trains for a bunch of things. We can't ticket the airlines.
We gotta wrap it up next.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
just
you for your
closing
thoughts. No,
thought.
I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you for tolerating my questions.
Of course, no, that's what I'm here for. All right, unless there's anything else, appreciate your time today. There is additional seminars, Airport 101. We also have some 201s that we've done in the past, so if there's interest for any of those, we'll be happy to make time to do those. So thank you.